Welcome to Facing the Future, brought to you by the Concord Coalition on WKXL, New Hampshire's talk radio station. I'm your host, Bob Bixby. Each week, we take a nonpartisan dive into topics related to the federal budget, the economy, and how it all affects our nation's future. This week, we're honored to be joined by Leon Panetta, who has spent more than 5 decades at the center of American public life, and few people have seen the federal budget from as many angles or with as much depth and experience. He served as a member of Congress, where he chaired the House Budget Committee. Then he went into the executive branch, where he served as director of the Office of Management and Budget and White House Chief of Staff under President Bill Clinton. And then to top it off, to round off his resume, I guess, a little bit, he came back as CIA director and then later Secretary of Defense under President Barack Obama. He founded the Panetta Institute for Public Policy in 1997 with his wife Sylvia, and he serves on many boards, including as co-chair with Mitch Daniels and Tim Penny of our good friends at the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. Today, we'll talk with Secretary Panetta about the fiscal challenges facing the country, what meaningful leadership on the budget really requires, and whether the political system is still capable of forging the kinds of bipartisan agreements that he worked on and helped shape in the past. Concord Coalition Executive Director Carolyn Bordeaux joins the conversation. Secretary Panetta, welcome to Facing the Future.
Bob, it's good to be with you and Carolyn. My congratulations for your continuing the great work that you're doing with the Concord Coalition. Uh, I'm sure you feel a little bit like we do at the committee, that sometimes we're voices in the wilderness, but I think there are important voices for fiscal discipline that have to continue. Someday we'll have people that in leadership positions who will listen to the importance of trying to straighten out our fiscal situation.
Well, I appreciate that. It does. You've been one of the consistent voices that's always been there. So let me start there. I'll use a Pentagon phrase or term. At least it's one that they use in the movies. I don't know if they actually use it, but there's something called DEFCON. DEFCON 1 through DEFCON 5 is the lowest level of risk, and DEFCON 1 is the highest alert status. So when you look at our fiscal situation right now, are we closer to DEFCON 5 or DEFCON 1?
Well, I don't think there's any question that we're closer to DEFCON 1 in terms of the threat to our national economy. And probably the biggest reason it's so risky is that we're living at a time when neither party seems willing to try to confront the hard choices that need to be made in order to restore some degree of fiscal discipline. And so what's happening is that there's a tremendous amount of borrowing going on, and there are very few that are willing to take on the difficult issues that, as you know, need to be taken on if you're going to be able to ultimately reduce the size of the deficit, but more importantly, the size of the debt that we have in this country. We have a record debt. We're paying interest on that debt of almost $1 trillion a year now, more than what we spend on defense, more than what we spend in healthcare. It is threatening our economic future. I don't think there's any question that we are on the verge of an economic crisis. When you combine the fact that we have this huge debt and that Social Security and Medicare are going broke in the next few years, and nobody seems to be very concerned about what we do in order to deal with those huge problems.
You mentioned the huge economic consequences. Could you play that out a little bit? Because you and like us, the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, sometimes it feels abstract to people, when you talk about debt and the thing. But I mean, when you've looked at this, how might Americans feel it in their daily lives?
Yeah, I think that, probably the biggest challenge that groups like the Concord Coalition face and the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget is how do we impress on the average American the importance of dealing with these huge fiscal issues. And I guess, the best way is to make clear to them that in their family budget, if they were running a huge debt and as a result were paying huge amounts on interest on that debt, that they would find it very difficult to be able to pay for the basics that their family needs. And so that's where the country is. We are in a situation where we're facing a huge debt. We're paying huge interest payments. It's eating up the resources that we need for the future. And as a consequence, areas that really do demand investment are not being made because the budget situation is so bad in Washington and so broken that there is no responsible approach that is currently being taken by the leadership of this country when it comes to our fiscal issues. I mean, that's a pretty brutal statement that the leadership of our country that is elected to go back to Washington to govern and to make sure that that we are abiding by the discipline that is essential on any budget, whether it's a family budget or a state budget or a community budget. We have to abide by a budget. And the problem right now is that nobody, either on the Democratic or Republican side, seems to be very concerned about the need to, first of all, restore the budget process, and secondly, then to take the tough decisions that are going to be necessary in order to try to deal with this huge debt that is going to impact on our future. I teach a lot of young students here at the Panetta Institute, and I look at them and ask myself that because of our inability to deal with this debt, we are going to be passing on to them and their generation a huge debt that is going to be even more burdensome in the future in terms of impacting on their ability to achieve the American dream. I mean, that's probably the most important thing maybe we need to say to the American people, which is we all believe in the American dream. We all believe in trying to give young people the opportunity to have a better life than we did. By virtue of the irresponsibility on the budget issue, I think we are impacting on the ability of these young people to ultimately be able to achieve the American dream in the future.
And I want to just get in one more. We're almost where we need to take the first break, but and I know Carolyn's got some follow-up questions on the budget process and what we can do about it. Are there national security implications for running debts this high?
No, absolutely. There's no question. I think it was Mike Mullen, Admiral Mike Mullen, who said that the greatest threat to our national security is the fact that we're running this huge debt right now. And that what we're by failing to manage our resources, what we're doing is undermining the funds that are going to be necessary to maintain our national security. And right now, when you look at what's happening in Washington, we know that appropriations are supposed to be passed by October 1. They have not been passed by October 1 for a number of years now. I think it's probably been about 20 years or more. And so we are operating on a continuing resolution. And there's a lot of uncertainty as to how much is going to be provided for our national defense. And the worst thing you can have happen at the Department of Defense, and I know this from being Secretary of Defense, is to have uncertainty about just exactly what your budget is going to be. Because you cannot invest in the future, you cannot invest in key areas if you just don't have the money available to do that. So it really is impacting on our security, and certainly it's impacting on the stability of our economy.
You're listening to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby. Concord Coalition Executive Director Carolyn Bordeaux and I are discussing the consequences of our growing debt and the challenges of that with Leon Panetta, former Secretary of Defense, former head of the Office of Management and Budget. We'll be right back after these short messages. Welcome back to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby. Concord Coalition Executive Director Carolyn Bordeaux and I are discussing the consequences of the growing U.S. debt and its many challenges with Leon Panetta, former Secretary of Defense, former CIA Director, former head of the Office of Management and Budget, former chairman of the House Budget Committee, and White House Chief of Staff. Carolyn, I know you had some questions to follow up about the budget process and what we can do about it.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you so much, Secretary Panetta, for being here. There are a few people who have extraordinarily distinguished careers who I just so admire, and you are one of those people. So I'm really honored that you could join us today. So talking some about the solutions here, we've talked about the budget process that is not really functioning anymore. What would be some of your recommendations around how to establish a functioning budget process and what a functional process would look like?
Well, it's very hard to recognize all of the important things that need to be done because none of them are being done. And so you're dealing with a Congress right now in which the budget process is totally broken. They haven't passed a budget resolution, I think, in over 20 years. And a budget resolution is critical to kind of laying out just exactly where are the priority areas and how do you discipline the budget. They haven't passed a budget. And they're failing to pass the appropriations bills on time. And so that's resulting in CRs. And we run into these constant threats to shut down the federal government because of it. I often say to the students here that in our democracy, we govern either by leadership or by crisis. If leadership is there, and the people that we elect, if leadership is there and they're willing to make tough decisions, then I think we can avoid or certainly contain crisis. But in the absence of leadership, we're going to govern by crisis. And when it comes to the budget, we are largely governing by crisis right now. And, in my day, when I first was elected to the Congress and then became chair of the Budget Committee, it really worked very well. I often say, in my 50 years of public life, I've seen Washington at its best and Washington at its worst. The good news is I saw Washington work. When I was in Congress, when I was a legislative assistant on the Senate side, I saw Republicans and Democrats willing to work together. They had their political differences, but when it came to big issues like the budget, they were willing to work together. When I was in Congress, we were facing what we thought was a huge deficit of almost, I think, about $300 billion. Right now, it's almost $2 trillion. And we were concerned about it. And so the presidents at the time were concerned about it, and so was the leadership in the Congress. And so, we came together. I can remember probably the thing that sticks in my mind the most is going to Andrews Air Force Base, meeting with Republicans and Democrats and representatives for the administration, and putting everything on the table, everything on the table. And that meant that, we looked at every part of the budget, whether it's defense discretionary. We looked at entitlements, which now are almost 2/3 of the federal budget. And we looked at revenues, at resources that we needed. We came up with a plan for $250 billion in deficit reduction that included a lot of savings from entitlement programs that produce savings over a period of 5 to 10 years. And we also raised revenues $250 billion. So we were able to do that on a bipartisan basis, and we passed that budget. President Clinton, when I became director of OMB, passed a similar budget, providing $500 billion in deficit reduction, $250 billion in spending savings, $250 billion in revenues. And it was the combination, frankly, of those two budgets that ultimately helped produce a balanced federal budget. And I thought when we achieved balance, I remember thinking, it isn't going to be politically sound for future members to now throw us into huge debts. Boy, was I wrong. Was I wrong? It didn't take very long before we were back in debt, and all of the work had been wiped out. So how do we try to get people willing to make these tough decisions? I think the problem right now is the politics is not good. You got both parties that don't want to deal with Social Security. They don't want to deal with Medicare. They don't want to deal with entitlement issues or programs. And they certainly don't want to deal with taxes and additional revenues. I'm afraid that the only way to try to create some discipline here is if there's a fiscal commission that brings together the best from both parties, as well as the business sector, and that they make a proposal, probably similar to the proposal that was made by the Simpson-Bowles Commission. But we need something like that, where there is a willingness to look at every area of the budget and determine how we achieve savings, determine how we put caps on spending, and determine what revenues need to be raised, and then puts discipline into the budget so that we pay for any proposal or require that it be paid for rather than simply borrow, whether it's cutting taxes or whether it's new spending, that has to be paid for and enforced. But it has to begin probably with a commission, and there has to be an up or down vote on their recommendations so that Congress can't fiddle around with the different proposals. I frankly think that's probably the only way to do this, and ultimately it's going to take a president and leadership in the Congress, their willingness to be able to take that step and then vote on that kind of proposal. But I'm afraid that that's where we're at right now, because the process is broken, and I don't see any effort to try to restore a viable and credible budget process.
I'm just going to pick up on two things. We are going into the holiday season, and so we're trying to bring a little hope to our our radio show and podcast here. But a couple points that you just made that are very important are, one, it has been solved in the past. It has been solved in a bipartisan basis. We have been able to get there. The other thing I find hopeful is that, when you talk to people behind the scenes, just like you laid out, everything has to be on the table. People do understand how to get there. It is not an unknown path. But I think the gap we do have, yes, is that political will aspect of things. And it's not a little gap. It's a big one, right? Just to follow up on that, one proposal that Concord has put out, and also the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, we're really leaning on, is to try to get the deficit to 3% of gross domestic product, which would essentially cut it in half. Can we just take a first step and try to cut it in half? What are your thoughts about that proposal and that being a first step to try to get things back under control?
I think it makes a lot of sense to try to set a realistic goal that can be achieved and supported by both parties. And on this proposal to move towards a 3% goal, I think the administration has talked about it. I know that Republicans and Democrats on the Hill have talked about it and supported it. But now it needs to get done. It needs to get done. And to get it done, and look, this president certainly has the opportunity to do something with regards to the fiscal crisis, but he himself has not been willing to take on some of the tough decisions. So I'm not sure whether it can happen with this president, to be frank.
What is it? What is a time horizon that you think, Congress might be able to accomplish cutting the deficit in half?
Yeah, no, I think there has to be political pressure on them to understand that if they don't act, that the country could face a major crisis. And that's why one of the other things we're supporting, and I think you're doing the same, is the need to address the Social Security issue. Because we know that the Social Security Trust Fund is going broke, and that can happen, within the next 6 to 7 years. And if that happens, Social Security benefits are going to be drastically cut or reduced. And the same thing is true for the Medicare Trust Fund. And that, I think, provides, a political crisis that members, if they're honest with their constituents, say, we've got to deal with this. And maybe if we can get them to address that issue, the issue of saving Social Security, saving Medicare, and bring together a bipartisan coalition to address some of the tough steps that have to be taken, that might be a good stepping stone towards trying to then get a 3% goal put in place, and then each year developing a budget that gets us to that goal. It'll take a while. I think it's 5-10 years to really be able to get it done. But I think right now, what we need is, in the very least, the leadership to set goals for where we have to go. I know it's tough to deal with entitlements. I know it's tough to deal with taxes, but in the very least, if you can set a goal and begin to take small steps towards achieving that goal, then I think what members of Congress will understand is that by making what are going to be some tough decisions, look, the public may not always like what they're going to do, but mark my words, the public will respect them a hell of a lot better.
We're going to have to take
effort to do it.
We're going to have to take our second break. You're listening to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby. Concord Coalition Executive Director Carolyn Bordeaux and I are discussing the debt and its consequences with Leon Panetta, former Secretary of Defense. We'll be right back after these short messages. Welcome back to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby. Concord Coalition Executive Director Carolyn Bordeaux and I are discussing the consequences of our nation's growing national debt with Leon Panetta. He is former Secretary of Defense. He's also been the Director of the President's Office of Management and Budget and Chairman of the House Budget Committee. probably has more budget experience, I think, than anybody when you put it all together over the years. And one of the interesting things from that resume is that you have served both in the executive branch and the legislative branch as part of the budget process. I mean, as chair of the House Budget Committee and then as director of the president's budget office. So you've seen this from the institutional prerogatives of both the legislative branch and the executive branch. And I'm wondering that a few things have come up this year that have raised questions about the power of the purse. There have been disagreements. The current administration takes a very expansive view of the executive branch power to spend money or not spend money, and a very expansive view of raising revenue through tariffs. Those things are being contested in court right now. We don't have issues. We don't have the Supreme Court's final word on those things. But I'm just wondering, what is the respective role of the two branches, congressional and executive, and why is it important that both branches perform their role, their constitutional function?
Well, it's interesting that you asked that question when we're on the brink of our 250th anniversary as a country. And we've all seen, I think, Ken Burns's description of the American Revolution. And what our forefathers were trying to do as they put together a new country. And it's interesting that they did not want power to be centralized in any one branch of government. They didn't want a king. They didn't want a king parliament. They didn't want a star chamber court. And so they developed three separate but equal branches of government, each a check and balance on the other. And their goal was to make sure that the representatives in Congress worked together, obviously had their differences, obviously had their own views as to how things were answered, but that they would have a dialogue and they would ultimately find consensus and compromise. And, for 250 years, we've been through various crises. But the reality is that our system of checks and balances kind of stood up and worked pretty well. And it's been threatened throughout those 250 years, but it stood up. And I'm a believer that ultimately our country works best, our government works best, when both political parties, Republican and Democrat, are willing to work together. And that's probably the most important fundamental step that needs to be taken right now, is that both parties, rather than trying to stop each other, rather than trying to attack each other as they are now, they've got to find ways to work together. Because when you're going to be making some of the tough decisions in the budget, it has to be bipartisan. Otherwise, one party will attack the other. The American people will find it hard to accept whatever is done. And the key right now is to not only have this bipartisanship, but make sure that everyone shares in the sacrifice of reducing this huge deficit we have and this huge debt. And so it's got to be everybody. I can remember when we did the budget plan with the $500 billion in deficit reduction. I remember going to a group, it was a business group, and they were complaining about high taxes in the bill. And I said, look, we're asking farmers to sacrifice in reducing some of their support prices. We're asking our veterans to sacrifice by reducing some of the benefits in the Veterans Administration. We're asking our senior citizens to bear some responsibility for reductions in Medicare, et cetera. I said almost every area of our budget, sacrifices are being made. So what makes you so special that you're not willing to sacrifice by at least paying some additional taxes in order for us to accomplish the principal goal, which is achieving fiscal discipline, reducing the deficit, and improving our economy overall? And they didn't have an answer to that, very frankly. They really didn't. And so it tells me that the key here has got to be to build that kind of consensus where people are willing to work together and make these tough decisions together. That's going to be the key to get back to that. But look, let's face it, the most important thing it's going to take is presidential leadership. If we had a president who campaigned on the issue that we are going to implement fiscal discipline, that's going to be a priority in his or her administration, then that would be critical to then getting the leadership in the House and the Senate to be able to work with that president to get it done. And that, I guess that's what I hope for ultimately in the future, is that we are able to get that kind of leadership that it's willing to make the tough decision.
I think one of the issues is lack of trust, on the Hill, and it gets into this issue of rescissions. Now, rescissions can be a perfectly good thing. I'm sure you sent up some rescission requests when you were OMB director, and the president even had the line item veto for a while until the Supreme Court struck it down. There's trust, and those things can be done in a bipartisan way. What happened this year was a very partisan use of rescissions, even to the point of doing a so-called pocket rescission. I don't want to get too deeply into the weeds, but it's just basically sending up a rescissions request when Congress doesn't have the statutorily mandated time to react, and then declaring, well, you didn't react, and so the funds are rejected. This doesn't seem to be a good way of building trust.
Yeah, no, it just doesn't work. It doesn't work. You're absolutely right. I think it was George Shultz, former Secretary of the Treasury, who used to tell me that trust is the coin of the realm when it comes to governing. Good things happen when there's trust, and bad things happen when there's no trust. And I think that's true. So there has to be trust, and there has to be a willingness of both parties to be able to work together. And both will then be able to benefit from the achievement that they both worked on. It'll be politically good for them to be able to do this, because the American people will say, for goodness sakes, thank God our democracy is finally functioning the way it's supposed to, with both parties working together. Because if it's partisan, I mean, if one party hopes that it can do whatever the hell it wants to do without in any way working with the other party, then mark my words, it'll ultimately fail. It will fail, because it'll become a political issue, and that party will be attacked. And ultimately, it will undermine the ability to try to govern together in our democracy. So to do that is not easy. I'm not, as we all know, politics right now is poisonous in Washington. And the divisions are deep, and there's tremendous partisanship. And there's a failure of the Congress to function. We just went through a huge shutdown of the federal government. Why? Because both parties failed, and the president failed to take steps to make sure that that would not happen. And so it's very dysfunctional right now. And I think it would be important to try to get leadership, and it's going to probably take new leadership, not only in the White House, but on Capitol Hill, to be willing to kind of really break this gridlock and say, the time has come for our democracy to function and to govern itself. Because if we don't take on these issues, and if we don't have the leadership to make these tough decisions, then I'm concerned, we can take two paths. One path is towards an American Renaissance, strong economy, strong future, on the cutting edge of technology, both parties working together, providing world leadership. Or if we don't have that leadership, we could very well be a country in decline and go the way of past empires. And I think that's the choice. That's the fundamental choice.
That was
do we want to lose our democracy, or do we want to be able to have an even greater democracy in the 21st century?
That was really Paul Tsongas used to say things like that back. I remember the beginning of the Concord Coalition, and but that is the choice. We're going to have to take our final break here. You're listening to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby, and Concord Coalition Executive Director Carolyn Bourdeau and I are talking with Leon Panetta, former chairman of the House Budget Committee and director of the President's Office of Management and Budget. We'll be right back after these short messages. Welcome back to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby. Concord Coalition Executive Director Carolyn Bourdeau and I are talking with Leon Panetta, former Secretary of Defense, former head of the Office of Management and Budget, and former chairman of the House Budget Committee. We're going to talk now about the importance of public engagement and the future of the country and the importance of young people being involved in this. Carolyn, let me go to you for some questions.
Okay, well, we'll start off with the public at large, and then go to the young people. But I think, yeah, a hopeful thing is, I think this issue is starting to become much more relevant. People are much more aware of the challenges and much more concerned about it. What do you recommend that our listeners do to engage on this issue and to try to move things forward?
Well, I really do believe in American leadership. We've been through 250 years. We've had very serious crises that we've had to confront. We had faced a civil war, 2 world wars, recessions, depressions, natural disasters of one kind or another. And somehow we've always been able to find the leadership to move forward. And I think the reason is because, the real strength of this country isn't in Washington. The real strength of this country is in communities across the country, both in red states and blue states. There are communities that are not Democrat or Republican. They're people that are working together to try to do what's right for their community. They're making the right decisions. They're trying to educate our children, trying to provide housing, trying to do all of the necessary things that we try to get accomplished. It's the spirit and resilience of the American people that I think is the most important quality that we have. And it's that spirit and resilience that I think, it's the American people, it's we the people who ultimately have to come together to make sure that we protect our democracy and don't have it fall apart on us. And it's the leadership that can motivate that kind of response by the American people, I think, is what's going to be needed if we're going to deal with tough problems and if we're going to be able to provide a legacy for our children in the future.
So on the note of young people, I know that you have the Panetta Institute. What is the Institute involved in terms of training the leaders of tomorrow?
Yeah, when my wife and I came back from Washington, I think it was after my time as chief of staff, to President Clinton. We came back, and I had I'd had a military post. Talking about cuts, I had a military post where I'm at. It's the old Fort Ord military complex that got closed by BRAC, which was the Base Closure Act, that closed a number of bases over that period. And so one of the things I did was to reuse the base, developed a task force to reuse the base to establish a university, California State University at Monterey Bay, which has been established. And so I began doing some teaching and working with young people, and my wife and I both were concerned that young people didn't seem to have an interest in public service. And as the son of Italian immigrants, my parents believed it was important to give something back to the country. And so my wife and I believed we really had to try to inspire a new generation to public service. So we established the Institute, and the purpose of it is to try to build a new generation of leaders for our country. So we do that through a number of programs. We have a lecture series that runs in the spring, in which I bring key people from Washington, both Republican and Democrat, to debate the issues that have to be addressed. And we do that for our students as well as for the community. We do a leadership program for student body officers, because I figure if you're a student body officer, you might be interested in politics. And so we do a long leadership course for them to really make them understand the challenges of leadership. We do an internship program in Washington where the president selects students. We bring them here to the Institute and train them for 2 weeks on Washington, on the issues that they're going to face, plus the operations of the office. So they're really good interns by the time they get back there. And they go back to Washington for 3.5 months and work in the offices of members of Congress from California, both Democrat and Republican. And it really works well. It's a great program, and there are a lot of young people who've been part of that program who are now running for office. They're running for Congress. They're running for city councils. They're running as supervisors. I think we've lit a light with regards to inspiring them. And then we have a program that, Bob, you'd probably be interested in this. I do it with lawyers from Santa Clara Law School, as well as some graduate students. And what we do is I want them to look at an issue, a major issue, whether it's immigration, healthcare, the budget. Give me the Republican position, give me the Democratic position, and then tell me what a compromise would look like. It's called governing. It's a lost art these days.
Love it. Love it.
So what I really try to do is to try to get them to think about how you do work together, how you try to govern and get it done. So those are some of the principal programs that have been very successful. We've now been at this job over 25 years. And the other thing we do is we have a big dinner where we honor leaders in the country for bipartisanship, to try to stress that it's important, if you're a leader in this country, that you're willing to work with the other side of the aisle. And so we've honored a lot of great people. John McCain, Feingold, went back to Moynihan, Chafee. So we really honored some great public servants. And we try to do that as a symbol of the kind of governing that we need in our democracy. So my wife and I are very proud of the Institute, and we get a lot of support in the community. And, I really do think that right now, what we need is a new generation of leaders for our democracy.
Do you find, by the way, I clerked for a judge one time that gave me an assignment similar to what you just said, because he couldn't figure out. So he said, give me a decision both ways. write a decision with the plaintiff wins and write a decision where the defendant wins. And so that was a very interesting exercise.
Yeah.
Um,
No. I always tell the lawyers it's not it's bad, it's great training for you, not only in terms of working in our democracy, but it happens to be great training for you as lawyers to be
yeah.
able to understand both sides of an issue.
Well, exactly. And because I brought that legal training into this job because I find with the Concord Coalition, that's you have to be able to understand both sides. And you have to
Exactly.
understand that in many cases, probably most cases, there is merit, there is some merit and some demerits to both sides. And it's a matter of balancing it,
Exactly.
it all out
Exactly.
through the process of negotiation. But I wanted to, I mean, the students that you deal with, the leadership of tomorrow, are they interested in the fiscal decision, fiscal issues? Or, I mean,
Well, you can imagine that one of the things I stress in the classes I teach them is the fiscal issue and the budget issue, and how important it was when I was there to try to put together a budget resolution and get members of Congress to support it, and then have it go through the Senate and then have to work on a compromise. But it was an outline that really provided the discipline we needed in order to eventually move towards a balanced budget. And I describe it, and then I describe what's happening in Washington today. That process is broken and it's not working. And I tell them you're going to go back to a Washington that, frankly, is dysfunctional. And the most important thing I want you to remember is not to get immersed in the trench warfare in Washington. I want you to stand back and look at both parties and listen to both parties. But for goodness sakes, don't be captured by the partisanship and the division that's there. And it's interesting, these last few classes I've had that have gone back to Washington really have come back understanding that right now the system is not working.
hmm.
And that we really are lacking the ability to try to work together to solve the problems facing our country. I mean, you look at the Congress right now, particularly the House of Representatives, they've passed one piece of legislation and they haven't done anything else. And
And,
Congress is not serving as the check that it should be. You mentioned the power of the purse. I think it's tragic that the Congress just kind of stood back and allowed some of these cuts to be made without raising concern about the fact that they're the ones that funded these programs. They're the ones who did these programs. It's their decision when it comes to spending. And yet, my sense is the Congress pays little attention to the power of the purse. And so, we're not in a good situation now, but I really do believe, particularly talking to these young people, that ultimately they understand that there has to be a better way. There has to be a better way.
I know a good optimistic note to leave on, and that's it. That's so we're gonna
I
wrap it
agree.
up there. Thank you for leaving us on an optimistic note. You've been listening to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby, and Concord Coalition Executive Director Carolyn Bordeaux and I have been talking with Leon Panetta, former director of the Office of Management and Budget, Secretary of Defense, White House Chief of Staff, Chairman of the House Budget Committee, CIA Director, and now a trainer of tomorrow's leadership. And I hope they all listen to you. I'll be back again next week with another edition of Facing the Future.